Chapter 11. But brandy, when administered in one of those small after-dinner glasses, can never do anything really constructive for a man whose affairs have so shaped themselves as to give him the momentary illusion of having been hit in the small of the back by the 20th Century Limited. A ton, or a hogshead of the stuff, might have enabled Bill to face the coming interview with a jaunty smile. The mere sip, which was all that had been vouchsafed to him, left him as pallid and boneless as if it had been sarsaparilla. Gazing through a mist at Captain Bigger, he closely resembled the sort of man for whom the police spread dragnets, preparatory to questioning them in connection with the recent smash-and-grab robbery at Marks and Schoenstein's Bon-Ton jewellery store on 8th Avenue. His face had shaded away to about the colour of the underside of a dead fish, and Jeeves, eyeing him with respectful commiseration, wished that it were possible to bring the roses back to his cheeks by telling him one or two good things which had come into his mind from the collected works of Marcus Aurelius. Captain Bigger, even when seen through a mist, presented a spectacle which might well have intimidated the stoutest. His eyes seemed to Bill to be shooting out long, curling flames, and why they called a man with a face as red as that a white hunter was more than he was able to understand. Strong emotion, as always, had intensified the vermilion of the captain's complexion, giving him something of the appearance of a survivor from an explosion in a tomato cannery. Nor was his voice, when he spoke, of a timbre calculated to lull any apprehensions which his aspect might have inspired. It was the voice of a man who needed only a little sympathy and encouragement to make him whip out a revolver and start blazing away with it. "So," he said. There are no good answers to the word "so," particularly when uttered in the kind of voice just described, and Bill did not attempt to find one. "So, you are honest Patch Perkins?" Jeeves intervened, doing his best as usual. "Well, yes and no, sir." "What do you mean, yes and no? Isn't this the lousiest patch?" demanded the captain, brandishing Exhibit A. "Isn't that the hellhound's ginger moustache?" he said, giving Exhibit B a twiddle. "And do you think I didn't recognize that coat and tie?" "What I was endeavouring to convey by the expression yes and no, sir, was that his lordship has retired from business." "You bet he has. Pity he didn't do it sooner." "Yes, sir. Oh, Iago, the pity of it, Iago." "Eh?" "I was quoting the Swan of Avon, sir." "Well, stop quoting the bally Swan of Avon." "Certainly, sir, if you wish it." Bill had recovered his faculties to a certain extent. To say that even now he was feeling bumps-a-daisy would be an exaggeration, but he was capable of speech. "Captain Bigger," he said, "I owe you an explanation." "You owe me £3,005 2 and 6, said the captain, coldly corrective. This silenced Bill again, and the captain took advantage of the fact to call him 11 derogatory names. Jeeves assumed the burden of the defence, for Bill was still reeling under the impact of the 11th name. "It is impossible to gainsay the fact that, in the circumstances, your emotion is intelligible, sir, for one readily admits that his lordship's recent activities are of a nature to lend themselves to adverse criticism. But can one fairly blame his lordship for what has occurred?" This seemed to the captain an easy one to answer. "Yes," he said. "You will observe that I employ the adverb fairly, sir. His lordship arrived on Epsom Downs this afternoon with the best intentions and a capital adequate for any reasonable emergency. He could hardly have been expected to foresee that two such meagerly favoured animals as Lucy Glitters and Whistler's mother would have emerged triumphant from their respective trials of speed. His lordship is not clairvoyant." "He could have laid the bets off." "There I am with you, sir. Rem acu tetigistae." "Eh?" A Latin expression which might be rendered in English by the American colloquialism, You said a mouthful. I urged his lordship to do so.
You?
I was officiating as his lordship's clerk. The captain stared.
You weren't the chap in the pink moustache?
Precisely, sir, though I would be inclined to describe it as russet rather than pink. The captain brightened.
So, you were his clerk, were you? Then when he goes to prison, you'll go with him.
Let us hope there will be no such sad ending as that, sir.
What do you mean, sad ending?
Said Captain Bigger. There was an uncomfortable pause. The captain broke it.
Well, let's get down to it, he said. No sense in wasting time. Properly speaking, I ought to charge this sheep-faced, shambling refugee from hell.
The name is Lord Rowcester, sir.
No, it's not. It's Patch Perkins. Properly speaking, Perkins, you slinking reptile, I ought to charge you for petrol consumed on the journey here from Epsom, repairs to my car, which wouldn't have broken down if I hadn't had to push it so hard in the effort to catch you, and, he added, struck with an afterthought, the 2 beers I had at the Goose and Gherkin while waiting for those repairs to be done. But I'm no hog. I'll settle for £3,005 2 and 6. Write me a cheque.
Bill passed a fevered hand through his hair. How can I write you a cheque? Captain Bigger clicked his tongue, impatient of his shilly-shallying.
You have a pen, have you not? And there is ink on the premises, I imagine. You are a strong, able-bodied young fellow in full possession of the use of your right hand, aren't you? No paralysis, no rheumatism in the joints. If, he went on, making a concession, what is bothering you is that you have run out of blotting paper, never mind. I'll blow on it.
Jeeves came to the rescue, helping out the young master, who was still massaging the top of his head. What his lordship is striving to express in words, sir, is that while, as you rightly say, he is physically competent to write a cheque for £3,005 2 shillings and 6pence, such a cheque, when presented at your bank, would not be honoured. Exactly, said Bill, well pleased with his lucid way of putting the thing. It would bounce like a bounding dervish and come shooting back like a homing pigeon. 2 very happy images, my lord. I haven't a bean. Insufficient funds is the technical expression, my lord. His lordship, if I may employ the argot, sir, is broke to the wide. Captain Bigger stared.
You mean you own a place like this, a bally palace, if ever I saw one, and can't write a cheque for £3,000?
Jeeves undertook the burden of explanation. A house such as Rowcester Abbey in these days is not an asset, sir. It is a liability. I fear that your long residence in the East has rendered you not quite abreast of the changed conditions prevailing in your native land. Socialistic legislation has sadly depleted the resources of England's hereditary aristocracy. We are living now in what is known as the welfare state, which means, broadly, that everybody is completely destitute. It would have seemed incredible to any of the native boys, hippopotami, rhinoceri, pumas, zebras, alligators and buffaloes with whom he'd come in contact in the course of his long career in the wilds, that Captain Bigger's strong jaw was capable of falling like an unsupported stick of asparagus. But it had fallen now in precisely that manner. There was something almost piteous in the way his blue eyes, round and dismayed, searched the faces of the 2 men before him. You mean he can't brass up? You have put it in a nutshell, sir. Who steals his lordship's purse steals trash. Captain Bigger, his iron self-control gone, became a human semaphore. He might have been a white hunter doing his daily dozen.
But I must have the money, and I must have it before noon tomorrow.
His voice rose in what, in a lesser man, would have been a wail.
Listen, I'll have to let you in on something that's vitally secret. And if you breathe a word to a soul, I'll rip you both asunder with my bare hands, shred you up into small pieces, and jump on the remains with hobnail boots. Is that understood?
Bill considered. Yes, that seems pretty clear, eh, Jeeves? Most straightforward, my lord. Carry on, Captain. Captain Bigger lowered his voice to a rasping whisper.
You remember that telephone call I made after dinner? It was to those pals of mine, the chaps who gave me my winning double this afternoon. Well, when I say winning double, said Captain Bigger, raising his voice a little, that's what it would have been, but for the degraded chiselling of a dastardly lop-eared...
Quite, said Bill hurriedly. You telephoned to your friends, you were saying?
I was anxious to know if it was all settled.
If all what was settled? Captain Bigger lowered his voice again, this time so far that his words sounded like gas escaping from a pipe.
There's something cooking. As Shakespeare says, we have an enterprise of great importance.
Jeeves winced. Enterprises of great pith and moment is the exact quotation, sir.
These chaps have a big SP job on for the Derby tomorrow. It's the biggest cert in the history of the race. The Irish horse, Ballymore.
Jeeves raised his eyebrows. Not generally fancied, sir.
Well, Lucy Glitters and Whistler's mother weren't generally fancied, were they? That's what makes this job so stupendous. Ballymore's a long-priced outsider. Nobody knows anything about him. He's been kept darker than a black cat on a moonless night. But let me tell you that he has had 2 secret trial gallops over the Epsom course and broke the record both times.
Despite his agitation, Bill whistled. You're sure of that?
Beyond all possibility of doubt. I watched the animal run with my own eyes, and it's like a streak of lightning. All you see is a sort of brown blur. We are putting our money on at the last moment, carefully distributed among a dozen different bookies, so as not to upset the price. And now, cried Captain Bigger, his voice rising once more, you're telling me that I shan't have any money to put on?
His agony touched Bill. He did not think, from what little he had seen of him, that Captain Bigger was a man with whom he could ever form one of those beautiful friendships you read about, the kind that existed between Damon and Pythias, David and Jonathan, or Swan and Edgar, but he could understand and sympathize with his grief. Too bad, I agree, he said, giving the fermenting hunter a kindly, brotherly look, and almost, but not quite, patting him on the shoulder. The whole situation is most regrettable, and you wouldn't be far out in saying that the spectacle of your anguish gashes me like a knife. But I'm afraid the best I can manage is a series of monthly payments, starting, say, about 6 weeks from now.
That won't do me any good.
Nor me, said Bill frankly. It'll knock the stuffing out of my budget, and mean cutting down on the necessities of life to the barest minimum. I doubt if I shall be able to afford another square meal till about 1954. Farewell. A long farewell. To what, Jeeves?
To all your greatness, my lord. This is the state of man. Today he puts forth the tender leaves of hope. Tomorrow blossoms, and bears his blushing honours thick upon him. The 3rd day comes a frost, a killing frost, and when he thinks, good easy man, full surely his greatness is a ripening, nips his roots.
Thank you, Jeeves.
Not at all, my lord.
Bill looked at him and sighed. You'll have to go, you know, to start with. I can't possibly pay your salary.
I shall be delighted to serve your lordship without emolument.
That's dashed good of you, Jeeves, and I appreciate it. About as nifty a display of the feudal spirit as I ever struck. But how, asked Bill keenly, could I keep you in fish? Captain Bigger interrupted these courteous exchanges. For some moments he'd been chafing, if chafing is the right word to describe a white hunter who's within an ace of frothing at the mouth. He said something so forceful about Jeeves's fish that speech was wiped from Bill's lips, and he stood goggling with the dumb consternation of a man who's been unexpectedly struck by a thunderbolt.
"I've got to have that money!"
His lordship has already informed you that, owing to the circumstances of his being fiscally crippled, that is impossible.
"Why can't he borrow it?"
Bill recovered the use of his vocal cords. "From whom?" he demanded peevishly. "You talk as if borrowing money was as simple as falling off a log." "The point his lordship is endeavouring to establish," explained Jeeves, "is the almost universal tendency of gentlemen to prove uncooperative when an attempt is made to float a loan at their expense. Especially if what you're trying to get into their ribs for is a whacking great sum like £3,005 2 and 6. "Precisely, my lord. Confronted by such figures, they become like the deaf adder that hearkens not to the voice of the charmer, charming never so wisely." "So, putting the bite on my social circle is off," said Bill. "It can't be done. I'm sorry." Captain Bigger seemed to blow flame through his nostrils.
"You'll be sorrier," he said, "and I'll tell you when you and this precious clerk of yours are standing in the dock at the Old Bailey, with a judge looking at you over his bifocals, and me in the well of the court making faces at you. Then's the time when you'll be sorry. Then, and shortly afterwards, when the judge pronounces sentence, accompanied by some strong remarks from the bench, and they lead you off to Wormwood Scrubs to start doing your 2 years hard, or whatever it is."
Bill gaped.
"Oh, dash it," he protested. "You wouldn't proceed to that, what, Jeeves?"
"Awful extreme, my lord."
You surely wouldn't proceed to that awful extreme?"
"Wouldn't I?"
"One doesn't want unpleasantness."
"What one wants and what one is going to get are two different things,"
said Captain Bigger, and went out, grinding his teeth to cool off in the garden. He left behind him one of those silences often called pregnant. Bill was the first to speak.
"We're in the soup, Jeeves."
"Certainly a somewhat sharp crisis in our affairs would appear to have been precipitated, my lord."
"He wants his pound of flesh."
"Yes, my lord."
"And we haven't any flesh."
"No, my lord. It is a most disagreeable state of affairs."
"He's a tough egg, that Bigger. He looks like a gorilla with stomachache."
"There is perhaps a resemblance to such an animal afflicted as your lordship suggests."
"Did you notice him at dinner?"
"To which aspect of his demeanour during the meal does your lordship allude?"
"I was thinking of that sinister way he tucked into the roast duck. He flung himself on it like a tiger on its prey. He gave me the impression of a man without ruth or pity."
"Unquestionably a gentleman lacking in the softer emotions, my lord."
"There's a word that just describes him. Begins with a V. Not vapid, not vermicelli. Vindictive. The chap's vindictive. I can understand him being sore about not getting his money, but what good will it do him to ruin me?"
"No doubt he will derive a certain moody satisfaction from it, my lord." Bill brooded.
"I suppose there really is nobody one could borrow a bit of cash from?"
"Nobody who springs immediately to the mind, my lord."
"How about that financier fellow who lives out Ditchingham way, Sir somebody something?"
"Sir Oscar Wapple, my lord. He shot himself last Friday."
"Oh, then we won't bother him."
Jeeves coughed. "If I might make a suggestion, my lord."
"Yes, Jeeves?"
A faint ray of hope had stolen into Bill's sombre eyes. His voice, while still scarcely to be described as animated, no longer resembled that of a corpse speaking from the tomb. "It occurred to me as a passing thought, my lord, that were we to possess ourselves of Captain Bigger's ticket, our position would be noticeably stabilized." Bill shook his head.
"I don't get you, Jeeves. Ticket? What ticket? You speak as if this were a railway station."
"I refer to the ticket which, in my capacity as your lordship's clerk, I handed to the gentleman as a record of his wager on Lucy Glitters and Whistler's mother, my lord."
"Oh!" You mean his ticket?
said Bill, enlightened. Precisely, my lord. As he left the racecourse so abruptly, it must still be upon his person, and it is the only evidence that exists that the wager was ever made. Once we had deprived him of it, your lordship would be in a position to make payment at your lordship's leisure.
I see. Yes, that would be nice. So we get the ticket from him, do we?
Yes, my lord.
May I say one word, Jeeves?
Certainly, my lord.
How?
By what I might describe as direct action, my lord.
Bill stared. This opened up a new line of thought. Set on him, you mean? Scrag him? Choke it out of him?
Your lordship has interpreted my meaning exactly.
Bill continued to stare. But Jeeves, have you seen him? That bulging chest? Those rippling muscles?
I agree that Captain Bigger is well nourished, my lord, but we would have the advantage of surprise. The gentleman went out into the garden. When he returns, we may assume that it will be by way of the French window by which he made his egress. If I draw the curtains, it will be necessary for him to enter through them. We will see him fumbling, and in that moment a sharp tug will cause the curtains to descend upon him, enmeshing him, as it were. Bill was impressed, as who would not have been?
By Jove, Jeeves, now you're talking. You think it would work?
Unquestionably, my lord. The method is that of the Roman retiarius, with whose technique your lordship is no doubt familiar.
That was the bird who fought with net and trident?
Precisely, my lord. So, if your lordship approves...
You bet I approve.
Very good, my lord. Then I will draw the curtains now, and we will take up our stations on either side of them. It was with deep satisfaction that Bill surveyed the completed preparations. After a rocky start, the sun was coming through the cloud rack.
It's in the bag, Jeeves.
A very apt image, my lord.
If he yells, we will stifle his cries with the, what do you call the stuff?
Velours, my lord.
We will stifle his cries with the velours, and while he's grovelling on the ground, I shall get a chance to give him a good kick in the tailpiece.
There is that added attraction, my lord. For blessings ever wait on virtuous deeds, as the playwright Congreve informs us. Bill breathed heavily.
Were you in the First World War, Jeeves?
I dabbled in it to a certain extent, my lord.
I missed that one because I wasn't born, but I was in the commandos in this last one. This is rather like waiting for 0 hour, isn't it?
The sensation is not dissimilar, my lord.
He should be coming soon.
Yes, my lord.
On your toes, Jeeves?
Yes, my lord.
All set?
Yes, my lord.
Hi,
said Captain Bigger in their immediate rear.
I want to have another word with you two.
A lifetime of braving the snares and perils of the wilds develops in those white hunters over the years a sort of sixth sense, warning them of lurking danger. Where the ordinary man, happening upon a tiger trap in the jungle, would fall in base over apex, your white hunter, saved by his sixth sense, walks around it. With fiendish cunning, Captain Bigger, instead of entering, as expected, through the French window, had circled the house and come in by the front door. Chapter 12. Although the actual time which had elapsed between Captain Bigger's departure and return had been only about 5 minutes, scarcely long enough for him to take half a dozen turns up and down the lawn, pausing in the course of one of them to kick petulantly at a passing frog, it had been ample for his purposes. If you had said to him, as he was going through the French window, "Have you any ideas, Captain?" he would have been forced to reply,
"No more than a rabbit."
But now his eye was bright and his manner jaunty. He had seen the way. On occasions of intense spiritual turmoil, the brain works quickly. Thwarted passion stimulates the little grey cells, and that painful scene on the rustic seat when love had collided so disastrously with the code that governs the actions of men who live on the frontiers of empire had stirred up those of Captain Bigger till, if you'd x-rayed his skull, You would have seen them leaping and dancing like rice in a saucepan. Not 30 seconds after the frog, rubbing its head, had gone off to warn the other frogs to watch out for atom bombs, he was rewarded with what he recognized immediately as an inspiration. Here was his position in a nutshell. He loved. Right. He would go further. He loved like the Dickens. And unless he'd placed a totally wrong construction on her words, her manner, and the light in her eyes, the object of his passion loved him. A woman, he meant to say, does not go out of her way to bring the conversation round to the dear old days when a fellow used to whack her over the top knot with clubs and drag her into caves, unless she intends to convey a certain impression. True, a couple of minutes later she'd been laughing and giggling with a frightful roaster excrescence, but that, it seemed to him, now that he'd had time to simmer down, had been merely a guest's conventional civility to a host. He dismissed the roaster gumboil as negligible. He was convinced that if one went by the form book, he had but to lay his heart at her feet, and she would pick it up. So far, so good. But here the thing began to get more complicated. She was rich, and he was poor. That was the hitch. That was the snag. That was what was putting the good old sand in the bally machinery. The thought that seared his soul and lent additional vigour to the kick he directed at the frog was that, but for the deplorable financial methods of that black-hearted bookmaker, Honest Patch Roaster, it would all have been so simple. £3,000 deposited on the nose of Ballymore at the current odds of 50 to 1 would have meant a return of 150,000, just like finding it. And surely even Tubby Frobisher and the Subadar, rigid though their views were, could scarcely accuse a chap of not playing with a straight bat if he married a woman, however wealthy, while himself in possession of 150,000 of the best and brightest. He groaned in spirit. A sorrow's crown of sorrow was remembering happier things, and he proceeded to torture himself with the recollection of how her neck had felt beneath his fingers as he fastened her pen. Captain Bigger uttered a short, sharp exclamation. It was in Swahili, a language which always came most readily to his lips in moments of emotion, but its meaning was as clear as if it had been the Eureka of Archimedes. Her pendant! Yes, now he saw daylight. Now he could start handling the situation as it should be handled. 2 minutes later, he was at the front door. 2 minutes and 25 seconds later, he was in the living room, eyeing the backs of Honest Patch Roaster and his clerk as they stood, for some silly reason known only to themselves, crouching beside the curtains which they'd pulled across the French window.
"Hi!" he cried. "I want to have another word with you two."
The effect of the observation on his audience was immediate and impressive. It's always disconcerting when you're expecting a man from the north-east to have him suddenly bark at you from the south-west, especially if he does so in a manner that recalls feeding time in a dog hospital. And Bill went into his quaking and leaping routine with a smoothness that comes from steady practice. Even Jeeves, though his features did not lose their customary impassivity, appeared, if one could judge by the fact that his left eyebrow flickered for a moment, as if about to rise, to have been stirred to quite a considerable extent.
"And don't stand there looking like a dying duck," said the captain, addressing Bill, who, one is compelled to admit, was giving a rather close impersonation of such a bird in articulo mortis. "Since I saw you two beauties last,"
he continued, helping himself to another whisky and soda,
"I have been thinking over the situation, and I have now got it all taped out. It suddenly came to me, quick as a flash. I said to myself, the pendant."
Bill blinked feebly. His heart, which had crashed against the back of his front teeth, was slowly returning to its base, but it seemed to him that the shock which he'd just sustained must have left his hearing impaired. It had sounded exactly as if the captain had said, "the pendant," which of course made no sense whatever. "The pendant?" he echoed, groping.
"Mrs. Spotsworth is wearing a diamond pendant, my lord," said Jeeves. "It is to this, no doubt, that the gentleman alludes."
It was specious, but Bill found himself still far from convinced. "You think so?"
"Yes, my lord."
"He alludes to that, in your opinion?"
"Yes, my lord."
But why does he allude to it, Jeeves? That, one is disposed to imagine, my lord, one will ascertain when the gentleman has resumed his remarks. Gone on speaking, you mean? Precisely, my lord. Well, if you say so, said Bill, doubtfully. But it seems, what's the expression you're always using? Remote contingency, my lord. That's right. It seems a very remote contingency. Captain Bigger had been fuming silently. He now spoke with not a little asperity.
If you have quite finished babbling, Patch Rooster...
Was I babbling?
Certainly you were babbling. You were babbling like whatever the dash things are that babble.
Brooks, said Jeeves helpfully, are sometimes described as doing so, sir. In his widely read poem of that name, the late Lord Tennyson put the words, "O brook, O babbling brook," into the mouth of the character Edmund, and later describes the rivulet, speaking in its own person, as observing, "I chatter over stony ways in little sharps and trebles. I bubble into eddying bays. I babble on the pebbles." Captain Bigger frowned.
"A ding hap camus for the late Lord Tennyson," he said impatiently. "What I'm interested in is this pendant."
Bill looked at him with a touch of hope. "Are you going to explain about that pendant? Throw light upon it, as it were?"
"I am. It's worth close on 3,000 quid, and,"
said Captain Bigger, throwing out the observation almost casually,
"you're going to pinch it, Patch Rooster."
Bill gaped. "Pinch it?"
"This very night."
It is always difficult for a man who is feeling as if he's just been struck over the occiput by a blunt instrument to draw himself to his full height and stare at someone censoriously. But Bill contrived to do so.
"What?"
he cried, shocked to the core. "Are you, a bulwark of the Empire, a man who goes about setting an example to Dyaks, seriously suggesting that I rob one of my guests?"
"Well, I am one of your guests, and you robbed me."
"Only temporarily."
"And you'll be robbing Mrs. Spotsworth only temporarily. I shouldn't have used the word pinch. All I want you to do is borrow that pendant till tomorrow afternoon, when it will be returned."
Bill clutched his hair. "Jeeves!" "My lord?" "Rally round, Jeeves. My brain's tottering. Can you make any sense of what this rhinoceros biffer is saying?" "Yes, my lord." "You can? Then you're a better man than I am, Gunga Din." "Captain Bigger's thought processes seem to me reasonably clear, my lord. The gentleman is urgently in need of money with which to back the horse Ballymore in tomorrow's derby, and his proposal, as I take it, is that the pendant shall be abstracted and pawned, and the proceeds employed for that purpose. Have I outlined your suggestion correctly, sir?"
"You have."
"At the conclusion of the race, one presumes, the object in question will be redeemed, brought back to the house, discovered, possibly by myself, in some spot where the lady might be supposed to have dropped it, and duly returned to her. Do I err in advancing this theory, sir?"
"You do not."
"Then could one be certain beyond the peradventure of a doubt that Ballymore will win?"
"He'll win all right. I told you, he had twice broken the course record."
"That is official, sir?"
"Straight from the feed box."
"Then I must confess, my lord, I see little or no objection to the scheme." Bill shook his head, unconvinced. "I still call it stealing." Captain Bigger clicked his tongue.
"It isn't anything of the sort, and I'll tell you why. In a way, you might say that that pendant was really mine."
"Really? What was that last word?"
"Mine. Let me," said Captain Bigger, "tell you a little story."
He sat musing for a while. Coming out of his reverie and discovering with a start that his glass was empty, he refilled it. His attitude was that of a man who, even if nothing came of the business transaction which he proposed, intended to save something from the wreck by drinking as much as possible of his host's whisky. When the refreshing draught had finished its journey down the hatch, he wiped his lips on the back of his hand and began.
"Do either of you chaps know the Long Bar at Shanghai?" "No?" "Well, it's the Café de la Paix of the East. They always say that if you sit outside the Café de la Paix in Paris long enough, you're sure, sooner or later, to meet all your pals, and it's the same with the long bar. A few years ago, chancing to be in Shanghai, I dropped in there, never dreaming that Tubby Frobisher and the Subadar were within 1,000 miles of the place, and I'm dashed if the first thing I saw wasn't the two old bounders sitting on a couple of stools as large as life. "Hello there, Bwana, old boy," they said when I rolled in, and I said, "Hello there, Tubby, hello there, Subadar, old chap," and Tubby said, "What'll you have, old boy?" and I said, "What are you boys having?" and they said, "Stingers." So I said that would do me all right. So Tubby ordered a round of stingers, and we started talking about Chowlwangs and Nai Barn Rot Phase, and where we'd all met last, and whatever became of the Poongi at Lampang, and all that sort of thing. And when the stingers were finished, I said, "The next are on me. What for you, Tubby, old boy?" And he said he'd stick to stingers. "And for you, Subadar, old boy," I said, and the Subadar said he'd stick to stingers too. So I wigwagged the barman and ordered stingers all round. And to cut a long story short, the stingers came. A stinger for Tubby, a stinger for the Subadar, and a stinger for me. "Luck, old boys," said Tubby. "Luck, old boys," said the Subadar. "Cheerio, old boys," I said, and we drank the stingers.
Jeeves coughed. It was a respectful cough, but firm. "Excuse me, sir." "Eh?" "I am reluctant to interrupt the flow of your narrative, but is this leading somewhere?" Captain Biggar flushed. A man who's telling a crisp, well-knit story does not like to be asked if it is leading somewhere.
"Leading somewhere? What do you mean, is it leading somewhere? Of course it's leading somewhere. I'm coming to the nub of the thing now. Scarcely had we finished this second round of stingers, when in through the door, sneaking along like a chap that expected any moment to be slung out in his fanny, came this fella in the tattered shirt and dungarees." The introduction of a new and unexpected character took Bill by surprise. "Which fellow in the tattered shirt and dungarees?" "This fellow I'm telling you about."
"Who was he?"
"You may well ask. Didn't know him from Adam, and I could see Tubby Frobisher didn't know him from Adam, nor did the Subadar. But he came sidling up to us, and the first thing he said, addressing me, was, 'Hello, Bimbo, old boy,' and I stared and said, 'Who on earth are you, old boy?' because I hadn't been called Bimbo since I left school. Everybody called me that there. God knows why, but out east it's been Bwana for as long as I can remember. And he said, 'Don't you know me, old boy? I'm Sycamore, old boy.' And I stared again, and I said, 'What's that, old boy? Sycamore? Sycamore? Not Beau Sycamore that was in the army class at Uppingham with me, old boy?' And he said, 'That's right, old boy, only it's Hobo Sycamore now.'"
The memory of that distressing encounter unmanned Captain Biggar for a moment. He was obliged to refill his glass with Bill's whisky before he could proceed.
"You could have knocked me down with a feather," he said, resuming. "This chap Sycamore had been the smartest, most dapper chap that ever adorned an army class, even at Uppingham."
Bill was following the narrative closely now. "They're dapper in the army class at Uppingham, are they?"
"Very dapper. And this chap Sycamore, as I say, the most dapper of the lot. His dapperness was a byword. And here he was, in a tattered shirt and dungarees, not even wearing a school tie."
Captain Biggar sighed.
I saw at once what must have happened. It was the old story. Morale can crumble very easily out east. Drink, women, and unpaid gambling debts.
Yes, said Bill. He'd gone under, had he?
Right under. It was pitiful. The chap was nothing but a bally beachcomber.
I remember a story of Morm's about a fellow like that.
I'll bet your friend Morm, whoever he may be, never met such a derelict as Sycamore. He had touched bottom. And the problem was, what was to be done about it? Well, Tubby Frobisher and the Subadar, of course, not having been introduced, were looking the other way and taking no part in the conversation. So it was up to me. Well, there isn't much you can do for these chaps who have let the East crumble their morale, except give them something to buy a couple of drinks with. And I was just starting to feel in my pocket for a baht or a tikal, when from under that tattered shirt of his, this chap Sycamore produced something that brought a gasp to my lips. Even Tubby Frobisher and the Subadar, though they hadn't been introduced, had to stop trying to pretend there wasn't anybody there and sit up and take notice. "Sober guy," said Tubby. "Pombahoo," said the subadar. And I don't wonder they were surprised. It was this pendant which you've seen tonight on the neck.
Captain Bigger faltered for a moment. He was remembering how that neck had felt beneath his fingers.
"On the neck,"
he proceeded, calling all his manhood to his aid,
"of Mrs. Spotsworth."
"Golly," said Bill, and even Jeeves, from the fact that the muscle at the side of his mouth twitched briefly, seemed to be feeling that after a slow start the story had begun to move. One saw now that all that stinger stuff had been merely the artful establishing of atmosphere, the setting of the stage for the big scene.
"I suppose you wouldn't care to buy this, Bimbo, old boy?" this chap Sycamore said, waggling the thing to make it glitter. And I said, "Fry me in olive oil, Bo, old boy. Where did you get that?"
"That's just what I was going to ask," said Bill, all agog. "Where did he?"
"God knows. I ought not to have inquired. It was dashed bad form. That's one thing you learn very early, out east of Suez. Never ask questions. No doubt there was some dark history behind the thing. Robbery, possibly murder. I didn't ask. All I said was, 'How much?' And he named a price far beyond the resources of my purse, and it looked as though the thing was going to be a washout. But fortunately, Tubby Frobisher and the subadar, I'd introduced them by this time, offered to chip in, and between us we met his figure, and he went off, back into the murk and shadows from which he had emerged. Sad thing. Very sad. I remember seeing this chap Sycamore make 146 in a house cricket match at school before being caught low down in the gully off a googly that dipped and swung away late. On a sticky wicket, too,"
said Captain Bigger, and was silent for a while, his thoughts in the past. He came back to the present.
"So, there you are,"
he said, with the air of one who has told a well-rounded tale. "But how did you get it?" said Bill.
"Huh?"
"The pendant. You said it was yours, and the way I see it is that it passed into the possession of a syndicate."
Yes. I didn't tell you that, did I? We shook dice for it, and I won. Tubby was never lucky with the bones, and nor was the subadar."
"And how did Mrs. Spotsworth get it?"
"I gave it her."
"You gave it her?"
"Why not? The dashed thing was no use to me, and I'd received many kindnesses from Mrs. Spotsworth and her husband. Poor chap was killed by a lion, and what was left of him shipped off to Nairobi, and when Mrs. Spotsworth was leaving the camp on the following day, I thought it would be a civil thing to give her something as a memento and all that. So I lugged out the pendant and asked her if she'd care to have it. She said she would, so I slipped it to her, and she went off with it. That's what I meant when I said, 'You might say that the bally thing was really mine,'"
said Captain Bigger, and helped himself to another whisky. Bill was impressed. "This puts a different complexion on things, Jeeves." "Distinctly, my lord." "After all, as Pop Bigger says, the pendant practically belongs to him, and he merely wants to borrow it for an hour or two."
"Precisely, my lord."
Bill turned to the captain. His mind was made up.
"It's a deal,"
he said.
"You'll do it?"
"I'll have a shot."
"Stout fella."
"Let's hope it comes off."
"It'll come off all right. The clasp is loose."
I meant, I hope nothing would go wrong." Captain Bigger scouted the idea. He was all buoyancy and optimism.
"Go wrong? What can possibly go wrong? You'll be able to think of 100 ways of getting the dashed thing. Two brainy fellows like you. Well," said the captain, finishing his whisky, "I'll be going out and doing my exercises."
"At this time of night?"
"Breathing exercises," explained Captain Bigger. "Yoga. And with it, of course, communion with a Jivatma or soul. Toodaloo, chaps."
He pushed the curtains aside and passed through the French window. Chapter 13. A long and thoughtful silence followed his departure. The room seemed very still, as rooms always did when Captain Bigger went out of them. Bill was sitting with his chin supported by his hand, like Rodin's penseur. Then he looked at Jeeves, and, having looked, shook his head.
"No, Jeeves," he said.
"My lord?"
"I can see that feudal gleam in your eye, Jeeves. You are straining at the leash, all eagerness to lend the young master a helping hand. Am I right?"
"I was certainly feeling, my lord, that in view of our relationship of thane and vassal, it was my duty to afford your lordship all the assistance that lay within my power."
Bill shook his head again. "No, Jeeves, that's out. Nothing will induce me to allow you to go getting yourself mixed up in an enterprise which, should things not pan out as planned, may quite possibly culminate in a 5-year stretch of one of our popular prisons. I shall handle this binge alone, and I want no back-chat about it."
"But, my lord—"
"No back-chat, I said, Jeeves."
"Very good, my lord."
"All I require from you is advice and counsel. Let us review the position of affairs. We have here a diamond pendant which, at the moment of going to press, is on the person of Mrs. Spotswood. The task confronting me, I said me, Jeeves, is somehow to detach this pendant from this person and nip away with it unobserved. Any suggestions?"
"The problem is undoubtedly one that presents certain points of interest, my lord."
"Yes, I'd got as far as that myself."
"One rules out anything in the nature of violence, I presume, placing reliance wholly on stealth and finesse."
"One certainly does. Dismiss any idea that I propose to swat Mrs. Spotswood on the napper with a blackjack."
"Then I would be inclined to say, my lord, that the best results would probably be obtained from what I might term the spider sequence."
"I don't get you, Jeeves."
"If I might explain, my lord, your lordship is joining the lady in the garden,
probably on a rustic seat.
Then, as I see it, my lord, conditions will be admirably adapted to the plan I advocate. If shortly after entering into conversation with Mrs. Spotswood, your lordship were to affect to observe a spider on her hair, the spider sequence would follow as doth the night the day. It would be natural for your lordship to offer to brush the insect off. This would enable your lordship to operate with your lordship's fingers in the neighbourhood of the lady's neck. And if the clasp, as Captain Bigger assures us, is loose, it will be a simple matter to unfasten the pendant and cause it to fall to the ground. Do I make myself clear, my lord?"
"All straight so far. But wouldn't she pick it up?"
"No, my lord, because in actual fact it would be in your lordship's pocket. Your lordship would institute a search in the surrounding grass, but without avail, and eventually the search would be abandoned until the following day. The object would finally be discovered late tomorrow evening."
"After Bigger gets back?"
"Precisely, my lord."
"Nestling under a bush?"
"Or on the turf, some little distance away. It had rolled."
"Do pendants roll?"
"This pendant would have done so, my lord." Bill chewed his lower lip thoughtfully.
"So, that's the spider sequence?"
"That is the spider sequence, my lord."
"Not a bad scheme at all."
"It has the merit of simplicity, my lord, and if your lordship is experiencing any uneasiness at the thought of opening cold, as the theatrical expression is, I would suggest our having what in stage parlance is called a quick run-through."
"A rehearsal, you mean?"
"Precisely, my lord. It would enable your lordship to perfect yourself in lines and business. In the Broadway section of New York, where the theatre industry of the United States of America is centered, I am told that this is known as ironing out the bugs."
"Ironing out the spiders?"
"Ha, ha, ha, my lord. But if I may venture to say so, it is unwise to waste the precious moments in verbal pleasantries."
"Time is of the essence?"
"Precisely, my lord. Would your lordship like to walk the scene?"
"Yes, I think I would. If you say it's going to steady the nervous system, I feel as if a troop of performing fleas were practicing buck and wing steps up and down my spine."
"I have heard Mr. Wooster complain of a similar malaise in moments of stress and trial, my lord. It will pass."
"When?"
"As soon as your lordship has got the feel of the part." "A rustic seat, your lordship said?"
"That's where she was last time."
"Scene, a rustic seat," murmured Jeeves. "Time, a night in summer. Discovered at rise, Mrs. Spotswood. Enter Lord Rowcester. I will portray Mrs. Spotswood, my lord. We open with a few lines of dialogue to establish atmosphere, then bridge into the spider sequence. Your lordship speaks. Bill marshalled his thoughts.
Tell me, Rosie.
Rosie, my lord?
Yes, Rosie, blast it. Any objection?
None whatever, my lord.
I used to know her at Cannes.
Indeed, my lord. I was not aware. You were saying, my lord?
Tell me, Rosie, are you afraid of spiders?
Why does your lordship ask?
There's rather an outsized specimen crawling on the back of your hair.
Bill sprang about 6 inches in the direction of the ceiling.
What on earth did you do that for?
He demanded irritably. Jeeves preserved his calm. My reason for screaming, my lord, was merely to add verisimilitude. I suppose that was how a delicately nurtured lady would be inclined to react on receipt of such a piece of information.
Well, I wish you hadn't. The top of my head nearly came off.
I'm sorry, my lord, but it was how I saw the scene. I felt it here, said Jeeves, tapping the left side of his waistcoat. If your lordship would be good enough to throw me the line once more.
There's rather an outsized specimen crawling on the back of your hair.
I would be grateful if your lordship would be so kind as to knock it off.
I can't see it now. Ah, there it goes, on your neck.
And that, said Jeeves, rising from the settee on which, in his role of Mrs. Spotsworth, he had seated himself, is cue for business, my lord. Your lordship will admit that it is really quite simple.
I suppose it is.
I am sure that after this tryout, the performing fleas to which your lordship alluded a moment ago will have substantially modified their activities.
They've slowed up a bit, yes, but I'm still nervous.
Inevitable on the eve of an opening performance, my lord. I think your lordship should be starting as soon as possible. If 'twere done, then 'twere done quickly. Our arrangements have been made with a view to a garden set. It would be disconcerting were Mrs. Spotsworth to return to the house, compelling your lordship to adapt your technique to an interior. Bill nodded.
I see what you mean. Right here, Jeeves. Goodbye.
Goodbye, my lord.
If anything goes wrong...
Nothing will go wrong, my lord.
But if it does, you'll write to me in Dartmoor occasionally, Jeeves? Just a chatty letter from time to time? Give me the latest news from the outer world?
Certainly, my lord.
It'll cheer me up as I crack my daily rock. They tell me conditions are much better in these modern prisons than they used to be in the old days.
So I understand, my lord.
I might find Dartmoor a regular home from home. Solid comfort, I mean to say.
Quite conceivably, my lord.
Still, we'll hope it won't come to that.
Yes, my lord.
Yes. Well, goodbye once again, Jeeves.
Goodbye, my lord. Bill squared his shoulders and strode out, a gallant figure. He'd summoned the pride of the roasters to his aid, and it buoyed him up. With just this quiet courage had a roaster of the 17th century mounted the scaffold at Tower Hill, nodding affably to the headsman and waving to friends and relations in the audience. When the test comes, blood will tell. He'd been gone a few moments when Jill came in. It seemed to Jeeves that in the course of the past few hours the young master's betrothed had lost a good deal of the animation which rendered her, as a rule, so attractive, and he was right. Her recent interview with Captain Bigger had left Jill pensive and inclined to lower the corners of the mouth and stare mournfully. She was staring mournfully now.
Have you seen Lord Rowcester, Jeeves?
His lordship has just stepped into the garden, miss.
Where are the others?
Sir Roderick and her ladyship are still in the library, miss.
And Mrs. Spotsworth?
She stepped into the garden shortly before his lordship. Jill stiffened.
Oh,
she said, and went into the library to join Monica and Rory. The corners of her mouth were drooping more than ever, and her stare had increased in mournfulness some 20%. She looked like a girl who was thinking the worst, and that was precisely the sort of girl she was. 2 minutes later, Captain Bigger came bustling in with a song on his lips. Yoga and communion with the Jivatma, or soul, seemed to have done him good. His eyes were bright and his manner alert. It is when the time for action has come that you always catch these white hunters at their best.
Pale hands I love beside the Shalimar, where are you now, where are you now?
Sang Captain Bigger.
How does the dashed thing go? I sink beneath your spell, la 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 la. Where are you now? Where are you now? For they're hanging Denny Deaver in the morning, he caroled, changing the subject. He saw Jeeves and suspended the painful performance. "Hello," he said. "Quay hey, my man. How are things?" "Things are in a reasonably satisfactory state, sir." "Where's Patch Rooster?" "His lordship is in the garden, sir." "With Mrs. Spotsworth?" "Yes, sir. Putting his fate to the test, to win or lose it all." "You thought of something, then?" "Yes, sir. The spider sequence." "The how much?" Captain Bigger listened attentively as Jeeves outlined the spider sequence, and when he'd finished, paid him a stately compliment. "You do well out east, my boy." "It is extremely kind of you to say so, sir." "That's to say, if that scheme was your own." "It was, sir." "Then you be just the sort of chap we want in Kuala Lumpur. We need chaps like you, chaps who can use their brains. Can't leave brains all to the Dyaks. Makes the blighters get above themselves." "The Dyaks are exceptionally intelligent, sir?" "Are they? Let me tell you something that happened to Tubby Frobisher and me one day when we—" He broke off, and the world was deprived of another excellent story. Bill was coming through the French window. A striking change had taken place in the 9th Earl in the few minutes since he'd gone out through that window. A young man of spirit setting forth on a high adventure. His shoulders, as we have indicated, had then been square. Now they sagged, like those of one who bears a heavy weight. His eyes were dull, his brow furrowed. The pride of the roasters appeared to have packed up and withdrawn its support. No longer was there in his bearing any suggestion of that 17th-century ancestor who'd infused so much of the party spirit into his decapitation on Tower Hill. The ancestor he most closely resembled now was the one who was caught cheating at cards by Charles James Fox in 1782. "Well?" cried Captain Bigger. Bill gave him a long, silent, mournful look and turned to Jeeves. "Jeeves." "My lord." "That spider sequence?" "Yes, my lord." "I tried it." "Yes, my lord." "And things looked good for a moment. I detached the pendant." "Yes, my lord." "Captain Bigger was right. The clasp was loose. It came off." Captain Bigger uttered a pleased exclamation in Swahili. "Gimme," he said. "I haven't got it. It slipped out of my hand." "And fell?" "And fell." "You mean it's lying in the grass?" "No," said Bill, with a sombre shake of the head. "It isn't lying in any ruddy grass. It went down the front of Mrs. Spotsworth's dress. It is now somewhere in the recesses of her costume." Chapter 14. It's not often that one sees 3 good men struck all of a heap simultaneously, but anybody who chanced to stroll into the living-room of Rowcester Abbey at this moment would have been able to observe that spectacle. To say that Bill's bulletin had had a shattering effect on his companions would be, if anything, to understate it. Captain Bigger was expressing his concern by pacing the room with whirling arms, while the fact that 2 of the hairs of his right eyebrow distinctly quivered showed how deeply Jeeves had been moved. Bill himself, crushed at last by the blows of fate, appeared formally to have given up the struggle. He'd slumped into a chair, and was sitting there looking boneless and despairing.
All he needed was a long white beard, and the resemblance to King Lear on one of his bad mornings would have been complete. Jeeves was the first to speak. "Most disturbing, my lord." "Yes," said Bill dully. "Quite a nuisance, isn't it? You don't happen to have any little-known Asiatic poison on you, do you, Jeeves?" "No, my lord." "A pity," said Bill. "I could have used it." His young employer's distress pained Jeeves, and as it had always been his view that there was no anodyne for the human spirit, when bruised like a spot of Marcus Aurelius, he searched in his mind for some suitable quotation from the Emperor's works. And he was just hesitating between "whatever may befall thee, it was preordained for thee from everlasting," and "nothing happens to any man which he is not fitted by nature to bear," both excellent, when Captain Bigger, who'd been pouring out a rapid fire of ejaculations in some native dialect, suddenly reverted to English.
"Doi wing lick!" he cried. "I've got it! Fricassee me with stewed mushrooms on the side. I see what you must do."
Bill looked up. His eyes were glazed, his manner listless. "Do?" he said. "Me?"
"Yes, you."
"I'm sorry," said Bill. "I'm in no condition to do anything except possibly expire, regretted by all." Captain Bigger snorted, and having snorted, uttered a cha, a pa, and a ba.
"Man pai non lap lao," he said impatiently. "You can dance, can't you?"
"Dance?"
"Preferably the Charleston. That's all I'm asking of you. A few simple steps of the Charleston."
Bill stirred slightly, like a corpse moving in its winding sheet. It was an acute spasm of generous indignation that caused him to do so. He was filled with what, in his opinion, was a justifiable resentment. Here he was, in the soup and going down for the third time, and this man came inviting him to dance before him as David danced before Saul. Assuming this to be merely the thin end of the wedge, one received the impression that in next to no time the White Hunter, if encouraged, would be calling for comic songs and conjuring tricks and imitations of footlight favourites who are familiar to you all. What, he asked himself bitterly, did the fellow think this was? The revival of vaudeville? A village concert in aid of the Church Organ Restoration Fund? Groping for words with which to express these thoughts, he found that the captain was beginning to tell another of his stories. Like Marcus Aurelius, Kuala Lumpur's favourite son always seemed to have up his sleeve something apposite to the matter in hand, whatever that matter might be. But where the Roman emperor, a sort of primitive Bob Hope or Groucho Marx, had contented himself with throwing off wisecracks, Captain Bigger preferred the narrative form.
"Yes, the Charleston," said Captain Bigger, "and I'll tell you why. I am thinking of the episode of Tubby Frobisher and the wife of the Greek consul. The recollection of it flashed upon me like a gleam of light from above."
He paused. A sense of something omitted, something left undone, was nagging him. Then he saw why this was so. The whisky. He moved to the table and filled his glass.
"Whether it was Smyrna or Joppa or Stamboul where Tubby was stationed at the time of which I speak," he said, draining half the contents of his glass and coming back with the rest, "I'm afraid I can't tell you. As one grows older, one tends to forget these details. It may have been Baghdad or half a dozen other places. I admit, frankly, that I have forgotten. But the point is that he was at some place somewhere, and one night he attended a reception or a soiree or whatever they call these binges at one of the embassies. You know the sort of thing I mean, fair women and brave men, all dolled up and dancing their ruddy heads off. And in due season it came to pass that Tubby found himself doing the Charleston with the wife of the Greek consul as his partner. I don't know if either of you have ever seen Tubby Frobisher dance the Charleston?"
"Neither his lordship nor myself have had the privilege of meeting Mr. Frobisher, sir," Jeeves reminded him courteously. Captain Bigger stiffened.
"Major Frobisher, damn it!" I beg your pardon, sir, Major Frobisher. Owing to our never having met him, the Major's technique when performing the Charleston is a sealed book to us. Huh? Captain Bigger refilled his glass. Well, his technique, as you call it, is vigorous. He does not spare himself. He is what in the old days would have been described as a three-collar man. By the time Tubby Frobisher has finished dancing the Charleston, his partner knows she has been in a fight all right. And it was so on this occasion. He hooked onto the wife of the Greek consul, and he jumped her up and he jumped her down, he whirled her about and he swung her around, he swung her here and he swung her there, and all of a sudden, what do you think happened? The lady had heart failure, sir? No, the lady didn't have heart failure, but what occurred was enough to give it to all present at that gay affair. For believe me or believe me not, there was a tinkling sound, and from inside her dress there began to descend to the floor silver forks, silver spoons, and, Tubby assures me, a complete toilet set in tortoiseshell. It turned out that the female was a confirmed kleptomaniac, and had been using the space between her dress and whatever she was wearing under her dress. I'm not a married man myself, so can't go into particulars, as a safe deposit. Embarrassing for Major Frobisher, sir. Captain Bigger stared. For Tubby? Why? He hadn't been pinching the things. He was merely the instrument for their recovery. But don't tell me you've missed the whole point of my story, which is that I am convinced that if Pat Rooster here were to dance the Charleston with Mrs. Spotsworth, with one tithe of Tubby Frobisher's determination and will to win, we'd soon rout that pendant out of its retreat. Tubby would have had it in the open before the band had played a dozen bars. And talking of that, we shall need music. Ah! I see a gramophone over there in the corner. Excellent. Well, do you grasp the scheme? Perfectly, sir. His lordship dances with Mrs. Spotsworth, and in due course the pendant droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. Exactly. What do you think of the idea? Jeeves referred the question to a higher court. What does your lordship think? He asked deferentially. Eh? Said Bill. What? Captain Bigger barked sharply. You mean you haven't been listening? Well, of all the... Jeeves intervened. In the circumstances, sir, his lordship may, I think, be excused for being distrait, he said reprovingly. You can see from his lordship's lacklustre eye that the native hue of his resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought. Captain Bigger's suggestion is, my lord, that your lordship shall invite Mrs. Spotsworth to join you in performing the dance known as the Charleston. This, if your lordship infuses sufficient vigour into the steps, will result in the pendant becoming dislodged and falling to the ground, whence it can readily be recovered and placed in your lordship's pocket. It was perhaps a quarter of a minute before the gist of these remarks penetrated to Bill's numbed mind, and when it did, the effect was electric. His eyes brightened, his spine stiffened. It was plain that hope had dawned and was working away once more at the old stand. As he rose from his chair, jauntily, and with the air of a man who was ready for anything, he might have been that debonair ancestor of his who, in the days of the Restoration, had, by his dash and gallantry, won from the ladies of King Charles II's court the affectionate sobriquet of Tabasco Roaster. "Lead me to her," he said, and his voice rang out clear and resonant. "Lead me to her, that is all I ask, and leave the rest to me." But it was not necessary, as it turned out, to lead him to Mrs. Spotsworth, for at this moment she came in through the French window with her Pekingese dog Pomona in her arms. Pomona, on seeing the assembled company, gave vent to a series of piercing shrieks. It sounded as if she were being torn asunder by red-hot pincers, but actually this was her method of expressing joy.
In moments of ecstasy, she always screamed, partly like a lost soul and partly like a scalded cat. Jill came running out of the library, and Mrs. Spotsworth calmed her fears. "It's nothing, dear," she said. "She's just excited, but I wish you would put her in my room if you're going upstairs. Would it be troubling you too much?"
"Not at all,"
said Jill aloofly. She went out, carrying Pomona, and Bill advanced on Mrs. Spotsworth.
"Shall we dance?"
he said. Mrs. Spotsworth was surprised. On the rustic seat just now, especially in the moments following the disappearance of a pendant, she'd found her host's mood markedly on the Byronic side. She could not readily adjust herself to this new spirit of gaiety. "You want to dance?"
"Yes, with you,"
said Bill, infusing into his manner a wealth of Restoration gallantry.
"It'll be like the old days at Cannes."
Mrs. Spotsworth was a shrewd woman. She had not failed to observe Captain Bigger lurking in the background, and it seemed to her that an admirable opportunity had presented itself of rousing the fiend that slept in him, far too soundly, in her opinion. What it was that was slowing up the White Hunter in his capacity of wooer she did not know, but what she did know was that there is nothing that so lights a fire under a laggard lover as the spectacle of the woman he loves treading the measure in the arms of another man, particularly another man as good-looking as William, Earl of Rowcester. "Yes, won't it?" she said, all sparkle and enthusiasm. "How well I remember those days! Lord Rowcester dances so wonderfully," she added, addressing Captain Bigger, and imparting to him a piece of first-hand information which, of course, he would have been sorry to have missed. "I love dancing. The one unpunished rapture left on earth."
"What-ho!"
said Bill, concurring.
"The old Charleston. Do you remember it?"
"You bet I do."
"Put a Charleston record on the gramophone, Jeeves."
"Very good, my lord." When Jill returned from depositing Pomona in Mrs. Spotsworth's sleeping quarters, only Jeeves, Bill, and Mrs. Spotsworth were present in the living-room. For, at the very outset of the proceedings, Captain Bigger, unable to bear the sight before him, had plunged through the French window into the silent night. The fact that it was he himself who'd suggested this distressing exhibition, recalling, as it did in his opinion, the worst excesses of the Carmagnole of the French Revolution, combined with some of the more risque features of native dances he'd seen in equatorial Africa, did nothing to assuage the darkness of his mood. The frogs on the lawn, which he was now pacing with a black scowl on his face, were beginning to get the illusion that it was raining number 11 boots. His opinion of the Charleston, as rendered by his host and the woman he loved, was one which Jill found herself sharing. As she stood watching from the doorway, she was conscious of much the same rising feeling of nausea which had afflicted the White Hunter when listening to the exchanges on the rustic seat. Possibly there was nothing in the way in which Bill was comporting himself that rendered him actually liable to arrest, but she felt very strongly that some form of action should have been taken by the police. It was her view that there ought to have been a law. Nothing is more difficult than to describe in words a Charleston danced by, on the one hand, a woman who loves dancing Charlestons and throws herself right into the spirit of them, and, on the other hand, by a man desirous of leaving no stone unturned in order to dislodge from some part of his associate's anatomy a diamond pendant which has lodged there. It'll be enough, perhaps, to say that if Major Frobisher had happened to walk into the room at this moment, he would instantly have been reminded of the old days in Smyrna or Joppa or Stamboul or possibly Baghdad. Mrs. Spotsworth he would have compared favourably with the wife of the Greek consul, while Bill he would have patted on the back, recognizing his work as fully equal, if not superior, to his own. Rory and Monica, coming out of the library, were frankly amazed.
"Good heavens,"
said Monica.
"The old boy cuts quite a rug, does he not?"
said Rory.
"Come, girl, let us join the revels."
He put his arm round Monica's waist, and the action became general. Jill, unable to bear the degrading spectacle any longer, turned and went out. As she made her way to her room, she was thinking unpleasant thoughts of her betrothed. It is never agreeable for an idealistic girl to discover that she has linked her lot with a libertine, and it was plain to her now that William, Earl of Rowcester, was a debauchee whose correspondence course might have been taken with advantage by Casanova, Don Juan, and the rowdier Roman emperors. "When I dance," said Mrs. Spotsworth, cutting, like her partner, quite a rug, "I don't know I've got feet." Monica winced.
"If you dance with Rory, you'd know you've got feet. It's the way he jumps on and off that gets you down."
"Ouch!" said Mrs. Spotsworth suddenly. Bill had just lifted her and brought her down with a bump, which would have excited Tubby Frobisher's generous admiration, and she was now standing rubbing her leg. "I've twisted something," she said, hobbling to a chair.
"I'm not surprised," said Monica. "The way Bill's dancing."
"Oh, gee, I hope it is just a twist and not my sciatica come back. I suffer so terribly from sciatica, especially if I'm in a place that's at all damp." Incredible as it may seem, Rory did not say, "Like Rowcester Abbey, what?" and go on to speak of the garden which in the winter months was at the bottom of the river. He was peering down at an object lying on the floor. "Hello," he said. "What's this? Isn't this pendant yours, Mrs. Spotsworth?" "Oh, thank you," said Mrs. Spotsworth. "Yes, it's mine. It must have... Oh, ouch!" she said, breaking off, and writhed in agony once more. Monica was all concern.
"You must get straight to bed, Rosalinda."
"I guess I should."
"With a nice hot water bottle."
"Yes."
"Rory will help you upstairs."
"Charmed," said Rory. "But why do people always speak of a nice hot water bottle? We at Harridge's say nasty hot water bottle. Our electric pads have rendered the hot water bottle obsolete. 3 speeds: autumn glow, spring warmth, and May west." They moved to the door, Mrs. Spotsworth leaning heavily on his arm. They passed out, and Bill, who'd followed them with a bulging eye, threw up his hands in a wide gesture of despair. "Jeeves!" "My lord?" "This is the end." "Yes, my lord." "She's gone to ground." "Yes, my lord." "Accompanied by the pendant." "Yes, my lord." "So, unless you have any suggestions for getting her out of that room, we're sunk. Have you any suggestions?" "Not at the moment, my lord." "I didn't think you would have. After all, you're human. And the problem is one which is not within... what, Jeeves?" "The scope of human power, my lord." "Exactly. Do you know what I'm going to do?" "No, my lord." "Go to bed, Jeeves. Go to bed and try to sleep and forget. Not that I have the remotest chance of getting any sleep, with every nerve in my body sticking out a couple of inches and curling up at the ends." "Possibly if your lordship were to count sheep." "You think that would work?" "It is a widely recognized specific, my lord." Bill considered. "Well, no harm in trying it. Good night, Jeeves." "Good night, my lord." Chapter 15. Except for the squeaking of mice behind the wainscoting, and an occasional rustling sound as one of the bats in the chimney stirred uneasily in its sleep, Rowcester Abbey lay hushed and still. 'Twas now the very witching time of night, and in the blue room Rory and Monica, pleasantly fatigued after the activities of the day, slumbered peacefully. In the Queen Elizabeth room, Mrs. Spotsworth, Pomona in her basket at her side, had also dropped off. In the Anne Boleyn room, Captain Bigger, the good man taking his rest, was dreaming of old days on the May Wang River, which, we need scarcely inform our public, is a tributary of the larger and more crocodile-infested Wang May. Jill, in the clockroom, was still awake, staring at the ceiling with hot eyes, and Bill, counting sheep in the Henry VIII room, had also failed to find oblivion. The specific recommended by Jeeves might be widely recognized, but so far it had done nothing toward enabling him to knit up the ravelled sleeve of care. 822, murmured Bill. 823, 800 He broke off, leaving the 824th sheep, an animal with a more than usually vacuous expression on its face, suspended in the air into which it had been conjured up. Someone had knocked on the door, a knock so soft and deferential that it could have proceeded from the knuckle of only one man. It was consequently without surprise that a moment later he perceived Jeeves entering. "Your lordship will excuse me," said Jeeves courteously. "I would not have disturbed your lordship had I not, listening at the door, gathered from your lordship's remarks that the stratagem which I proposed had proved unsuccessful." "No, it hasn't worked yet," said Bill. "But come in, Jeeves, come in." He would have been glad to see anything that was not a sheep. "Don't tell me," he said, starting as he noted the gleam of intelligence in his visitor's eye, "that you've thought of something." "Yes, my lord. I'm happy to say that I fancy I have found a solution to the problem which confronted us." "Jeeves, you're a marvel!" "Thank you very much, my lord. I remember Bertie Wooster saying to me once that there was no crisis which you were unable to handle." "Mr. Wooster has always been far too flattering, my lord." "Nonsense! Not nearly flattering enough. If you have really put your finger on a way of overcoming the superhuman difficulties in our path—" "I feel convinced that I have, my lord." Bill quivered inside his mauve pyjama jacket. "Think well, Jeeves," he urged. "Somehow or other we have got to get Mrs. Spotsworth out of her room for a lapse of time sufficient to enable me to bound in, find that pendant, scoop it up, and bound out again, all this without a human eye resting upon me. Unless I have completely misinterpreted your words owing to having suffered a nervous breakdown from counting sheep, you seem to be suggesting that you can do this. How? That is the question that springs to the lips. With mirrors?" Jeeves did not speak for a moment. A pained look had come into his finely chiselled face. It was as though he'd suddenly seen some sight which was occasioning him distress. "Excuse me, my lord. I am reluctant to take what is possibly a liberty on my part." "Oh, carry on, Jeeves. You have our ear. What's biting you?" "It is your pyjamas, my lord. Had I been aware that your lordship was in the habit of sleeping in mauve pyjamas, I would have advised against it. Mauve does not become your lordship. I was once compelled, in his best interests, to speak in a similar vein to Mr. Wooster, who, at that time, was also a mauve pyjama addict." Bill found himself at a loss. "How have we got onto the subject of pyjamas?" he asked wonderingly. "They thrust themselves on the notice, my lord. That very aggressive purple. If your lordship would be guided by me and substitute a quiet blue, or possibly a light pistachio green—" "Jeeves!" "My lord?" "This is no time to be prattling of pyjamas." "Very good, my lord." "As a matter of fact, I rather fancy myself in mauve, but that, as I say, is neither here nor there. Let us postpone the discussion to a more suitable moment. I will, however, tell you this. If you really have something to suggest with reference to that pendant, and that something brings home the bacon, you may take these mauve pyjamas and raise them to the ground and sow salt on the foundations." "Thank you very much, my lord." "It'll be a small price to pay for your services. Well, now that you've got me all worked up, tell me more. What's the good news? What is this scheme of yours?" "A quite simple one, my lord. It is based on—" Bill uttered a cry. "Don't tell me! Let me guess. The psychology of the individual?" "Precisely, my lord." Bill drew in his breath sharply. "I thought as much. Something told me it was. Many a time and oft, exchanging dry martinis with Bertie Wooster in the bar of the Drones Club, I've listened to him rapt as he spoke of you and the psychology of the individual. He said that once you get your teeth into the psychology of the individual, it's all over except chucking one's hat in the air and doing spring dances. Proceed, Jeeves. You interest me strangely. The individual whose psychology you've been brooding on at the present juncture is, I take it, Mrs. Spotsworth? Am I right or wrong, Jeeves? Perfectly correct, my lord. Has it occurred to your lordship what is Mrs. Spotsworth's principal interest? The thing uppermost in the lady's mind? Bill gaped. You haven't come here at 2 a.m. to suggest that I dance the Charleston with her again? Oh, no, my lord. Well, when you spoke of her principal interest, there is another facet of Mrs. Spotsworth's character which you have overlooked, my lord. I can see that she is an enthusiastic Charleston performer, but what principally occupies her thoughts is psychical research. Since her arrival at the Abbey, she has not ceased to express a hope that she may be granted the experience of seeing the spectre of Lady Agatha. It was that I had in mind when I informed your lordship that I had formulated a scheme for obtaining the pendant based on the psychology of the individual. Bill sank back on the pillows, a disappointed man. No, Jeeves, he said. I won't do it. My lord, I see where you're heading. You want me to dress up in a farthingale and wimple and sneak into Mrs. Spotsworth's room, your contention being that if she wakes and sees me, she will simply say, "Ah, the ghost of Lady Agatha," and go to sleep again. It can't be done, Jeeves. Nothing will induce me to dress up in women's clothes, not even in such a deserving cause as this one. I might stretch a point and put on the old moustache and black patch. I would not advocate it, my lord. Even on the racecourse I've observed clients, on seeing your lordship, start back with visible concern. A lady discovering such an apparition in her room might quite conceivably utter a piercing scream. Bill threw his hands up with a despondent groan. Well, there you are then. The thing's off. Your scheme falls to the ground and becomes null and void. No, my lord, your lordship has not, if I may say so, grasped the substance of the plan I am putting forward. The essential at which one aims is the inducing of Mrs. Spotsworth to leave her room, thus rendering it possible for your lordship to enter and secure the pendant. I propose now, with your lordship's approval, to knock on Mrs. Spotsworth's door and request the loan of a bottle of smelling salts. Bill clutched at his hair. You said, Jeeves? Smelling salts, my lord. Bill shook his head. Counting those sheep has done something to me, he said. My hearing's become affected. It sounded to me just as if you had said smelling salts. I did, my lord. I would explain that I required them in order to restore your lordship to consciousness. There again, I could have sworn that I heard you say, restore your lordship to consciousness. Precisely, my lord. Your lordship has sustained a severe shock. Happening to be in the vicinity of the ruined chapel at about the hour of midnight, your lordship observed the wraith of Lady Agatha and was much overcome. How your lordship contrived to totter back to your room, your lordship will never know, but I found your lordship there in what appeared to be a coma, and immediately applied to Mrs. Spotsworth for the loan of her smelling salts. Bill was still at a loss. I don't get the gist, Jeeves. If I might elucidate my meaning still further, my lord, the thought I had in mind was that, learning that Lady Agatha was, if I may so term it, on the wing, Mrs. Spotsworth's immediate reaction would be an intense desire to hasten to the ruined chapel in order to observe the manifestation for herself. I would offer to escort her thither, and during her absence... It's never immediately that the ordinary man, stunned by some revelation of genius, is able to find words with which to express his emotion. When Alexander Graham Bell, meeting a friend one morning in the year 1876, said, "Oh, hello, George, heard the latest. I invented the telephone yesterday," it is probable that the friend merely shuffled his feet in silence. It was the same with Bill now. He could not speak. He lay there dumbly, while remorse flooded over him that he could ever have doubted this man. It was just as Bertie Wooster had so often said. Let this fish-fed mastermind get his teeth into the psychology of the individual, and it was all over except chucking your hat in the air and doing spring dances. "Jeeves!" he began at length, finding speech. But Jeeves was shimmering through the door. "You're smelling salts, my lord," he said, turning his head on the threshold. "If your lordship will excuse me." It was perhaps 2 minutes, though to Bill it seemed longer, before he returned bearing a small bottle. "Well?" said Bill eagerly. "Everything has gone according to plan, my lord. The lady's reactions were substantially as I had anticipated. Mrs. Spotsworth, on receiving my communication, displayed immediate interest. Is your lordship familiar with the expression Jiminy Christmas?" "No, I don't think I ever heard it. You don't mean Merry Christmas?" "No, my lord, Jiminy Christmas. It was what Mrs. Spotsworth observed on receiving the information that the phantasm of Lady Agatha was to be seen in the ruined chapel. The words, I gathered, were intended to convey surprise and elation. She assured me that it would take but a brief time to hop into a dressing gown, and that, at the conclusion of that period, she would be with me with, I understood her to say, her hair in a braid. I am to return in a moment and accompany her to the scene of the manifestation. I will leave the door open a few inches, so that your lordship, by applying your lordship's eye to the crack, may be able to see us depart. As soon as we have descended the staircase, I would advocate instant action, for I need scarcely remind your lordship that time is of the essence. No, you certainly don't have to tell me that. You remember what you were saying about cheetahs, with reference to their speed of foot, my lord?" "That's right. Half a mile in 45 seconds, I think you said?" "Yes, my lord." "Well, the way I shall move would leave the nippiest cheetah standing at the post." "That will be highly satisfactory, my lord. I, on my side, may mention that on the dressing-table in Mrs. Spotsworth's room I observed a small jewel-case, which I have no doubt contains the pendant. The dressing-table is immediately beneath the window. Your lordship will have no difficulty in locating it." He was right, as always. It was the first thing that Bill saw when, having watched the little procession of two out of sight down the stairs, he hastened along the corridor to the Queen Elizabeth room. There, as Jeeves had stated, was the dressing-table. On it was the small jewel-case of which he had spoken, and in that jewel-case, as he opened it with shaking hands, Bill saw the pendant. Hastily he slipped it into the pocket of his pyjamas, and was turning to leave when the silence, which had been complete but for his heavy breathing, was shattered by a series of dreadful screams. Reference has been made earlier to the practice of the dog Pomona of shrieking loudly to express the ecstasy she always felt on beholding a friend, or even what looked to her like a congenial stranger. It was ecstasy that was animating her now. In the course of that session on the rustic seat, when Bill had done his cooing, she had taken an immediate fancy to her host, as all dogs did. Meeting him now in this informal fashion, just at a moment when she'd been trying to reconcile herself to the solitude which she so disliked, she made no attempt to place any bounds on her self-expression. Screams sufficient in number and volume to have equipped a dozen baronets stabbed in the back in libraries burst from her lips, and their effect on Bill was devastating. The author of The Hunting of the Snark says of one of his protagonists in a powerful passage, "So great was his fright that his waistcoat turned white." And the experience through which he was passing nearly caused Bill's mauve pyjamas to do the same. Though fond of Pomona, he did not linger to fraternize. He shot out of the door at a speed which would have had the most athletic cheetah shrugging its shoulders helplessly, and arrived in the corridor just as Jill, roused from sleep by those awful cries, came out of the clock-room. She watched him steal softly into the Henry VIII room, and thought in bitter mood that a more suitable spot for him could scarcely have been found. It was some quarter of an hour later, as Bill, lying in bed, was murmuring, 998, 999, 1000, that Jeeves entered. He was carrying a salver. On that salver was a ring. "I encountered Miss Wyvern in the corridor a few moments ago, my lord," he said. "She desired me to give this to your lordship." Chapter 16. Wyvern Hall, the residence of Colonel Aubrey Wyvern, father of Jill and chief constable of the county of South Moultonshire, lay across the river from Rowcester Abbey. And on the following afternoon, Colonel Wyvern, having worked his way scowlingly through a most inferior lunch, stumped out of the dining-room and went to his study and rang for his butler. And in due course the butler entered, tripping over the rug with a muffled "Whoops," his invariable practice when crossing any threshold. Colonel Wyvern was short and stout, and this annoyed him, for he would have preferred to be tall and slender. But if his personal appearance gave him pangs of discomfort from time to time, they were as nothing compared to the pangs the personal appearance of his butler gave him. In England today, the householder in the country has to take what he can get in the way of domestic help, and all Colonel Wyvern had been able to get was the scrapings and scourings of the local parish school. Bulstrode, the major domo of Wyvern Hall, was a skinny stripling of some 16 summers, on whom nature, in her bounty, had bestowed so many pimples that there was scarcely room on his face for the vacant grin which habitually adorned it. He was grinning now, and once again, as always happened at these staff conferences, his overlord was struck by the closeness of the lad's resemblance to a half-witted goldfish peering out of a bowl. "Bulstrode," he said, with a parade-ground rasp in his voice. "Yes," replied the butler affably. At another moment, Colonel Wyvern would have had something to say on the subject of this unconventional verbal approach, but today he was after bigger game. His stomach was still sending up complaints to the front office about the lunch, and he wanted to see the cook. "Bulstrode," he said, "bring the cook to me." The cook, conducted into the presence, proved also to be one of the younger set. Her age was 15. She bustled in, her pigtails swinging behind her, and Colonel Wyvern gave her an unpleasant look. "Trelawney," he said. "Yes," said the cook. This time there was no reticence on the part of the chief constable. The Wyverns did not as a rule war upon women, but there are times when chivalry is impossible. "Don't say 'yes,' you pie-faced little excrescence," he thundered. "Say 'yes, sir,' and say it in a respectful and soldierly manner, coming smartly to attention with the thumbs on the seams of the trousers. Trelawney, that lunch you had the temerity to serve up today was an insult to me and a disgrace to anyone daring to call herself a cook, and I've sent for you to inform you that if there is any more of this spirit of slackness and laissez-faire on your part—" Colonel Wyvern paused. The "I'll tell your mother," with which he had been about to conclude his sentence, seemed to him to lack a certain something. "You'll hear of it," he said, and feeling that even this was not as good as he could have wished, infused such vigour and venom into his description of underdone chicken, watery Brussels sprouts, and potatoes you couldn't get a fork into, that a weaker girl might well have wilted. But the Trelawneys were made of tough stuff. They did not quail in the hour of peril. The child met his eye with iron resolution and came back strongly. "Hitler," she said, putting out her tongue. The chief constable started.
Did you call me Hitler?
Yes, I did.
Well, don't do it again, said Colonel Wyvern sternly. You may go, Trelawney.
Trelawney went, with her nose in the air, and Colonel Wyvern addressed himself to Bulstrode. A proud man is never left unruffled when worsted in a verbal duel with a cook, especially a cook aged 15 with pigtails. And in the Chief Constable's manner, as he turned on his butler, there was more than a suggestion of a rogue elephant at the height of its fever. For some minutes he spoke well and forcefully, with particular reference to the other's habit of chewing his sweets ration while waiting at table, and when at length he was permitted to follow Evangeline Trelawney to the lower regions in which they had their being, Bulstrode, if not actually shaking in every limb, was at any rate subdued enough to omit to utter his customary "whoops" when tripping over the rug. He left the Chief Constable, though feeling a little better after having cleansed his bosom of the perilous stuff that weighs upon the soul, still definitely despondent. "Ichabod," he was saying to himself, and he meant it. In the golden age before the social revolution, he was thinking a gaping, pimpled, tripper over rugs like this Bulstrode would have been a lowly hall boy, if that. It revolted a Tory of the old school's finer feelings to have to regard such a blot on the South Moultonshire scene in the sacred light of a butler. He thought nostalgically of his young manhood in London at the turn of the century, and of the vintage butlers he'd been wont to encounter in those brave days. Butlers who weighed 250 pounds on the hoof. Butlers with 3 chins and bulging abdomens. Butlers with large gooseberry eyes, and that austere, supercilious butlerine manner which has passed away so completely from the degenerate world of the 1950s. Butlers had been butlers then, in the deepest and holiest sense of the word. Now they were mere chinless boys who sucked toffee and said "yes" when you spoke to them. It was almost inevitable that a man living so near to Rowcester Abbey and starting to brood on butlers should find his thoughts turning in the direction of the Abbey's principal ornament. And it was with a warm glow that Colonel Wyvern now began to think of Jeeves. Jeeves had made a profound impression on him. Jeeves, in his opinion, was the goods. Young Rowcester himself was a fellow the Colonel, never fond of his juniors, could take or leave alone, but this man of his, this Jeeves, he had recognized from their first meeting as something special. Out of the night that covered the Chief Constable, black as the pit, after that disturbing scene with Evangeline Trelawney from pole to pole, there shone a sudden gleam of light. He himself might have his Bulstrode, but at least he could console himself with the thought that his daughter was marrying a man with a butler in the fine old tradition on his payroll. It put heart into him. It made him feel that this was not such a bad little old world after all. He mentioned this to Jill when she came in a moment later, looking cold and proud, and Jill tilted her chin and looked colder and prouder. She might have been a snow queen, or something of that sort. "I'm not going to marry Lord Rowcester," she said curtly. It seemed to Colonel Wyvern that his child must be suffering from some form of amnesia, and he set himself to jog her memory. "Yes, you are," he reminded her. "It was in the Times. I saw it with my own eyes. The engagement is announced between... I have broken off the engagement." That little gleam of light of which we were speaking a moment ago, the one we showed illuminating Colonel Wyvern's darkness, went out with a pop, like a stage moon that has blown a fuse. He stared incredulously. "Broken off the engagement? I am never going to speak to Lord Rowcester again." "Don't be an ass," said Colonel Wyvern. "Of course you are. Not going to speak to him again? I never heard such nonsense. I suppose what's happened is that you've had one of these lovers' tiffs." Jill didn't intend to allow without protest what was probably the world's greatest tragedy since the days of Romeo and Juliet to be described in this inadequate fashion. One really must take a little trouble to find the mot juste. It was not a lover's tiff, she said, all the woman in her flashing from her eyes. If you want to know why I broke off the engagement, it was because of the abominable way he's been behaving with Mrs. Spotsworth. Colonel Wyvern put a finger to his brow. Spotsworth? Spotsworth. Ah, yes. That's the American woman you were telling me about. The American trollop, corrected Jill coldly. Trollop? Said Colonel Wyvern, intrigued. That was what I said. Why do you call her that? Did you catch them, trolloping? Yes, I did. God gracious. Jill swallowed once or twice, as if something jagged in her throat was troubling her. It all seems to have started, she said, speaking in that toneless voice which had made such a painful impression on Bill, in Cannes some years ago. Apparently, she and Lord Rowcester used to swim together at Eden Rock and go for long drives in the moonlight. And you know what that sort of thing leads to. I do indeed, said Lord Wyvern with animation, and was just about to embark on an anecdote of his interesting past, when Jill went on, still speaking in that same strange, toneless voice. She arrived at the Abbey yesterday. The story that's been put out is that Monica Carmoyle met her in New York and invited her to stay, but I have no doubt that the whole thing was arranged between her and Lord Rowcester, because it was obvious how matters stood between them. No sooner had she appeared than he was all over her, making love to her in the garden, dancing with her like a cat on hot bricks. And, said Jill, nonchalantly, wearing the mask like the Mrs. Fish who had so diverted Captain Bigger by doing the can-can in her step-ins in Kenya, coming out of her room at 2 o'clock in the morning in mauve pyjamas. Colonel Wyvern choked. He'd been about to try to heal the rift by saying that it was quite possible for a man to exchange a few civil remarks with a woman in a garden and while away the long evening by partnering her in the dance, and still not be in any way culpable, but this statement wiped the words from his lips. Coming out of her room in mauve pyjamas? Yes. Mauve pyjamas? Bright mauve. God bless my soul. A club acquaintance, annoyed by the eccentricity of the other's bridge game, had once told Colonel Wyvern that he looked like a retired member of Sanger's troupe of midgets, who, for years, had been doing himself too well on the starchy foods. And this was in a measure true. He was, as we have said, short and stout. But when the call to action came, he could triumph over his brevity of stature and rotundity of waistcoat and become a figure of dignity and menace. It was an impressive chief constable who strode across the room and rang the bell for Bulstrode. Yes, said Bulstrode. Colonel Wyvern choked down the burning words he would have liked to utter. He told himself that he must conserve his energies. Bulstrode, he said, bring me my horsewhip. Down in the forest of pimples on the butler's face, something stirred. It was a look of guilt. It's gone, he mumbled. Colonel Wyvern stared. Gone? What do you mean? Gone? And where? Bulstrode choked. He'd been hoping that this investigation might have been avoided. Something had told him that it would prove embarrassing. To the menders. To be mended. It got cracked. Cracked? Yes, said Bulstrode, in his emotion adding the unusual word, sir. I was cracking it in the stable yard, and it cracked, so I took it to the menders. Colonel Wyvern pointed an awful finger at the door. Get out, you foul blot, he said. I'll talk to you later. Seating himself at his desk, as he always did when he wished to think, he drummed his fingers on the arm of his chair. I'll have to borrow young Rowcester's, he said at length, clicking his tongue in evident annoyance. Infernally awkward,
calling on a fellow you're going to horsewhip and having to ask him for the loan of his horsewhip to do it with. Still, there it is, said Colonel Wyvern philosophically. That's how it goes.
He was a man who could always adjust himself to circumstances. Chapter 17. Lunch at Rowcester Abbey had been a much more agreeable function than lunch at Wyvern Hall, on a different plane altogether, where Colonel Wyvern had been compelled to cope with the distressing efforts of a pig-tailed incompetent, apparently under the impression that she was catering for a covey of buzzards in the Gobi Desert. The revellers at the Abbey had been ministered to by an expert. Earlier in this chronicle, passing reference was made to the virtuosity of Bill's O.C. kitchen, the richly gifted Mrs. Piggott, and in dishing up the midday meal today, she had in no way fallen short of her high ideals. 3 of the 4 celebrants at the table had found the food melting in their mouths, and had downed it with cries of appreciation. The exception was the host himself, in whose mouth it had turned to ashes. What with one thing and another, the instability of his financial affairs, last night's burglarious interlude, and its devastating sequel, the shattering of his romance, Bill was far from being the gayest of all that gay company. In happier days he'd sometimes read novels in which characters were described as pushing their food away untasted, and had often wondered, being a man who enjoyed getting his calories, how they could have brought themselves to do it. But at the meal, which was now coming to an end, he had been doing it himself, and, as we say, what little nourishment he'd contrived to take had turned to ashes in his mouth. He'd filled in the time mostly by crumbling bread, staring wildly, and jumping like a galvanized frog when spoken to. A cat in a strange alley would have been more at its ease. Nor had the conversation at the table done anything to restore his equanimity. Mrs. Spotsworth would keep bringing it round to the subject of Captain Bigger, regretting his absence on the feast, and each mention of the white hunter's name had had a seismic effect on his sensitive conscience. She did it again now. "Captain Bigger was telling me," she began, and Rory uttered one of his jolly laughs.
He was he? He said in his tactful way. Well, I hope you didn't believe him.
Mrs. Spotsworth stiffened. She sensed a slur on the man she loved. "I beg your pardon?"
Awful liar, that chap.
"Why do you say that, Sir Roderick?"
"I was thinking of those yarns of his at dinner last night."
"They were perfectly true."
"Not a bit of it," said Rory buoyantly. "Don't you let him pull your leg, my dear Mrs. Dogsbody. All these fellows from out east are the most frightful liars. It's due, I believe, to the ultraviolet rays of the sun in those parts. They go out without their solar topies, and it does something to them. I have this from an authoritative source. One of them used to come to headquarters a lot when I was in the guns, pistols, and ammunition, and we became matey. And one night, when in his cups, he warned me not to swallow a single word any of them said. 'Look at me,' he reasoned. 'Did you ever hear a chap tell the ghastly lies I do? Why, I haven't spoken the truth since I was so high. And so low are standards east of Suez that my nickname out there is George Washington.'
'Coffee is served in the living-room, my lord,' said Jeeves, intervening in his polished way, and averting what promised, judging from the manner in which Mrs. Spotsworth's eyes had begun to glitter, to develop into an ugly brawl. Following his guests into the living-room, Bill was conscious of a growing sense of uneasiness and alarm. He'd not supposed that anything could have increased his mental discomfort, but Rory's words had done so 100-fold. As he lowered himself into a chair, accepted a cup of coffee, and spilled it over his trousers, one more vulture had added itself to the little group already gnawing at his bosom. For the first time he began to question the veracity of Captain Bigger's story of the pendant, and at the thought of what he'd let himself in for, if that story had not been true, his imagination boggled. Dimly he was aware that Rory and Monica had collected all the morning papers and were sitting surrounded by them, their faces grave and tense. The sands were running out. Less than an hour from now, the derby would be run, and soon, if ever, they must decide how their wagers were to be placed.
"Racing news," said Monica, calling the meeting to order. "What does the racing news say, Rory?"
Rory studied that sheet in his slow, thorough way.
A lot of stuff about the guineas form. Perfect rot, all of it. You can't go by the guineas. Too many unknowns. If you want my considered opinion, there's nothing in sight to beat Taj Mahal. The Aga has the mares, and that's what counts. The sires don't begin to matter compared with the mares.
"I'm glad to hear you pay this belated tribute to my sex."
Yes, I think for my 2 quid, it's Taj Mahal on the nose.
"That settles Taj Mahal for me. Whenever you bet on them, they start running backwards. Remember that dog race?"
Rory was obliged to yield this point.
I admit my nominee let the side down on that occasion, he said. But when a real rabbit gets loose on a dog track, it's bound to cause a bit of confusion. Taj Mahal gets my 2 goblins.
"I thought your money was going on oratory."
Oratory is my outsider bet. 10 bob each way.
"Well, here's another hunch for you. Escalator."
Escalator?
Wasn't H's the first store to have escalators?
By Jove, yes! We've got the cup, you know. Our safety landing device has enabled us to clip 3 seconds off the record. The Oxford Street boys are livid. I must look into this escalator matter.
Lester Pickett's riding it.
That settles it. L. Pickett is the name of the chap stationed in the trunks, bags and suitcases. As fine a man as ever punched a time clock. I admit his L stands for Lancelot, but that's a good enough omen for me.
Monica looked across at Mrs. Spotsworth.
"I suppose you think we're crazy, Rosalinda."
Mrs. Spotsworth smiled indulgently.
"Of course not, dear. This brings back the good old days with Mr. Bessemer. Racing was all he ever thought of. We spent our honeymoon at Sheepshead Bay. It's the Derby, is it, you're so interested in?" "Just our silly little annual flutter. We don't bet high. Can't afford to. We have to watch the pennies."
"Rigidly,"
said Rory. He chuckled amusedly, struck by a whimsical idea.
"I was just thinking,"
he went on, in explanation of his mirth,
"that the smart thing for me to have done would have been to stick to that pendant of yours I picked up last night and go off to London with it and pawn it, thus raising a bit of... Yes, old man?"
Bill swallowed.
"I didn't speak. I thought you did."
"No, just a hiccup."
"To which,"
Rory conceded,
"you were fully entitled. If a man can't hiccup in his own house, in whose house can he hiccup? Well, summing up, Taj Mahal, 2 quid. Escalator, 10 bob each way. I'll go and send off my wire."
He paused.
"But wait, is it not rash to commit oneself without consulting Jeeves?"
"Why, Jeeves?"
"My dear Moke, what that man doesn't know about form isn't worth knowing. You should have heard him yesterday when I asked him if he had any views on the respective contestants in England's premier classic race. He just stood there, rattling off horses and times and records as if he were the Archbishop of Canterbury."
Monica was impressed.
"I didn't know he was as hot as that. Are there no limits to the powers of this wonder man? We'll go and confer with him at once."
They hurried out, and Bill, having cleared his throat, said, Mrs. Spotsworth looked up inquiringly.
Rosie, that pendant of yours, the one Rory was speaking of."
"Yes?"
"I was admiring it last night. It's nice, isn't it?"
"Beautiful."
"You didn't have it at Cannes, did you?" "No, I hadn't met Mr. Spotsworth then. It was a present from him."
Bill leapt. His worst suspicions had been confirmed.
"A present from Mr.
he gasped. Mrs. Spotsworth laughed.
"Oh, it's too funny," she said. "I was talking to Captain Bigger about it last night, and I told him one of my husbands gave it to me, but I couldn't remember which. It was Mr. Spotsworth, of course. So silly of me to have forgotten."
Bill gulped. "Are you sure?"
"Oh, quite."
It wasn't given to you by some fellow on one of those hunting expeditions as a sort of memento?"
Mrs. Spotsworth stared. "What do you mean?"
"Well, I thought, fellow grateful for kindnesses, saying goodbye, might have said, 'Won't you accept this as a little memento?' and all that sort of thing."
The suggestion plainly offended Mrs. Spotsworth. "Do you imagine that I accept diamond pendants from fellows, as you call them?"
"Well,
I wouldn't dream of such a thing. Mr. Spotsworth bought that pendant when we were in Bombay. I can remember it as if it were yesterday. A funny little shop with a very fat Chinaman behind the counter, and Mr. Spotsworth would insist on trying to speak Chinese. And just as he was bargaining, there was an earthquake. Not a bad one, but everything was all red dust for about 10 minutes. And when it cleared, Mr. Spotsworth said, 'Let's get out of here,' and paid what the man was asking, and grabbed the pendant, and we raced out and never stopped running till we had got back to the hotel."
A dull despair had Bill in its grip. He heaved himself painfully to his feet. "I wonder if you would excuse me," he said. "I have to see Jeeves about something."
"Well, ring for Jeeves."
Bill shook his head. "No, I think, if you don't mind, I'll go and see him in his pantry." It had occurred to him that in Jeeves' pantry there would be a drop of port, and a drop of port, or some similar restorative, was what his stricken soul craved.